All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation to be here. It's really exciting. So yeah, like Greg said, I have been a member of DVOC for a while. I actually was an intern supported through the DVOC Intern Fund at the Academy of Natural Sciences. So that was like maybe almost 10 years ago at this point. So it's been a while, but I'm really happy to be back. And this time I'm excited because I'm not the one that's going to be sharing the research that we're doing. My students are going to be able to share the research that we're doing. So I'm so thrilled to be able to bring them here today. So I'm going to take a little bit of time just to introduce the system that we have set up here, or not here, over about 45 minutes west of here in Westchester. And then they are going to talk all about their individual research projects on this system, which are all really fantastic. And I'm so excited for you guys to be able to hear them today. So when I started at Westchester not a year and a half ago at this point, so I'm coming up on the year and a half mark, I decided to set up a system of cavity nests, or also known as nest boxes, for the birds that breed in that area. And we set up nest boxes in two main locations around Westchester. And they are Stroud Preserve. So if anyone's familiar with the area, it's about a 5-minute drive from Westchester's campus. And then we've actually been able to set up nest boxes directly on Westchester's campus. So we have them set up near some of the athletic fields. We have them set up in the Gordon Natural Area, which is a natural preserve that we have directly on campus. And we built the nest boxes and we set them up and the birds came. It was very exciting. It kind of felt like a Field of Dreams scenario, if anyone is familiar with that movie. And so today my students are going to tell you all about what we've learned so far from these nest boxes. And I wanted to introduce briefly the two stars of the show because we do have two species that have been breeding in these nest boxes more than many of the others. We have these two that are very common. So the first is our eastern bluebird, which I'm sure you're familiar with. These guys are the second most common that we're seeing using the nest boxes. But the most common, and I'm a little biased, this one is my favorite, so I'm kind of happy about this outcome. The most common species that we have using these nest boxes are tree swallows. So a lot of the work you'll hear today will be about tree swallows, but we have a lot of other species that have been using these nest boxes. And so Hailey's going to get into some of the additional species that we've observed using these nest boxes and what their nests are kind of starting to look like. All right, so to very briefly intro everyone who will be speaking here today, I have 3 awesome undergraduate students and 1 awesome master's student. So today we're going to kick off with a talk from Chris Smith. He is going to tell you all about some of the diet items that these birds are actually relying on, what we can learn about the insect populations and how they might be impacting the birds that we're studying. Next, we're going to switch to Sage and Victoria, who will be telling you a little bit about potentially some impacts of variation in diet on exposure to certain types of pollutants. And there we're actually going to dip a little bit away from cavity nesting songbirds and a little bit more towards a whole range of birds. So we're not just cavity nesting folks here, we like all birds. And then we're going to end with a talk from Hailey Melvin. She is going to tell you a little bit about some of the pollutants that we're actually finding directly in the nests of these birds in the nest boxes on and around campus and nearby. So at this point, I'm just going to turn it away to them. I think what we'll do is we'll have each student give their talk and then have about 5 minutes for questions before we move on to the next student. So we're going to start off today with Chris.
And people can put your questions in the chat also as they go along. That way you can conserve those, and you won't have to remember back through 2 or 3 presentations.
Hello, my name is Christopher Smith. I'm an undergraduate student at Westchester with getting my bachelor's degree in biology with a concentration in ecology and conservation. And my research is focused on the changes in insect biomass availability during the tree swallow breeding season. So I know we're all bird lovers here, but to be bird lovers, you kind of have to love the insects too. So we'll be talking mostly about diet. So obviously insects are primary consumers. They play a very significant role in their ecosystems. And then we'll be tying that into how it relates to our key species, which is the tree swallow. So a little bit of backgrounds about insects first. 73% of all animal species on planet Earth are insects. And since 1998, we have seen a decline of 76% of them. there's three supposed reasons or main reasons. The first being rising global temperatures. This is so critical because insect species are very sensitive to not only temperature, but also humidity and levels like of rainfall. Habitat destruction is the next one. They can't live if they don't have anywhere to live. And then the third is the general lack of advocacy or just general unawareness of insects as a category. They make up 73% of animal phyla, and yet they are usually the least adorned of all of them, and yet they are usually the most important. So my research focuses on Nematocera. It is a suborder of flies. Think mosquitoes, crane flies, midges, the ones that usually ruin the picnic. But they are tree swallows' favorite and most important diet. And they are associated with what we call highly unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids. These are chemicals that the tree swallows rely on very heavily for their nesting development. This includes immune system, nervous system, and overall better fitness. Our study also incorporated Diptera, beetles, Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, wasps, bees, ants, and Hemiptera, which are true bugs. But our focus was really on Nematocera. So a little bit of background about Nematocera specifically. So insects often go through periods of highs and lows throughout a given season throughout the same year. It is very common for the beginning of the season for the emergence of these aquatic insects to be very high. And then as humidity and temperatures rise, their levels plummet. And then usually they return a little bit back in the end of the year as the humidity goes down and fall rolls in. So our questions for this study, now that we know what we need to about insects, is what does the Nematocera population look like in Westchester throughout the spring and summer? And how do these trends we see align with the local tree swallow breeding season? So this is their most important food source. And so they are definitely going to influence the nesting and breeding season of these birds as their most important food source. So to take these samples, we set up a malaise trap. It is this white tent structure. The bugs get caught in the black mesh in the middle, and then they get filtered up through underneath the white tented area into these bottles. On your left, my right, I think. Yes. The bottles, that shows an empty bottle, and then what the bottles look like after 3 days of sampling, typically. Each sample was taken over a 3-day period. There were 3 samples in total. The first was all of these numbers and dates go off of what has already been established as averages in the area since we are the first year that this study is going on. So the first was the average lay date, the average hatch date, and the average day 12. And then these samples were taken and I hand sorted them using tweezers, a variety of microscopes, and several cross-references, including the Kaufman Guide for Insects. It was very, very, very helpful. And so this is what the setup looked like. They were just sorted individually into each order, and then Nematocera was separated from the Diptera order by far. And then some photos I just couldn't bear to leave out of my presentation just as a general appreciation for these insects. These are some fantastic photos I was able to capture and only a fraction of the amazing things that I was able to see. The one on the side is just a weevil. As you can see, its long mouth parts. Diptera wing. This photo you can see individual hairs. There's a housefly wing. And then I thought the compound eyes of the leafhoppers was really, really interesting. But these birds really, really rely on these insects. So I thought it would be nice to be able to appreciate them ourselves as well. And then after all of this, our data was based on the weigh numbers and the biomass percentages. So for our Nematocera, you can see they're outlined in blue because they're aquatic emergent insects versus our terrestrial Diptera, which are in green. As you can see, Diptera starts out pretty low in the beginning of the season and spikes and then continues on that continually like declining trajectory. This follows the normal average patterns in which these insects usually go throughout the summer. You see the dips. But as you can see, Nematocera was highest in the beginning of the season, which was not very high in general at all, and then never makes any sort of rebound or increase and didn't for the rest of our data. And what we thought was really interesting was you can see our compared to our clutch initiation graph, more than half of our sampling period, all of the eggs had hatched before our sampling period even started. And the whole point of our sampling period is to figure out what these birds are eating and what part of their breeding season. So it was really interesting to see that Nematocera is not only highest earliest in the season, but also these birds seem to also have been changing the days in which they lay to be earlier in the year. And that might be correlated with the amount of Nematocera available to feed their chicks. They're going to follow their food sources. So we've just thought that it was really interesting that not only are our insect populations reflecting national averages, so are our tree swallow. Because as you can see, this was data taken from Ithaca, New York. And you can also see that from 1980, tree swallows have been laying their eggs earlier and earlier every year, which, as I said, we can see that in the Westchester population as well. So there might be a correlation between their food source availability and their breeding seasons. In conclusion of our data and just the discussion in general, our data, again, follows national trends, except for our key species. Nematocera actually usually rebounds in the middle of the season, but ours did not. Species definitely continued a gradual decline throughout the season. And while this correlates with the tree swallow breeding changes, this is the first year in which this kind of study has been taking place in Westchester. This is the first data set on biomass availability of any insects in Westchester. So we have many more sample periods to look forward to because we don't know if the data that we took this year might be an outlier or not. But it was definitely very interesting to see that both numbers were correlated. And so the big take-home message is if you love birds, you gotta at least appreciate the bugs. I know that the creepy crawlies are usually our least favorite, but they are most important. And when you see a lot of mosquitoes out, just know that your tree swallow friends and other aerial insectivores are very, very happy. So for my acknowledgements, I wanted to first thank Peter Dunn for the protocol and study management. My data set is just one out of many that are nationwide throughout the USA and Canada. These are being taken at various locations and are all derived from work that was done in Germany in 2018. Yeah, a big thanks to Peter Dunn just for allowing the Westchester University to add our data to the data set. And then I wanted to thank Dr. Ferris at Westchester, another biology professor, for equipment. He allowed us to use some of his microscopes. And then I wanted to thank all of you for allowing me to give my talk. I know bugs aren't the most interesting or exciting thing, but they are, again, extremely important. So I just want to thank you all for letting me present. So.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So I will take some questions from the room. If you have any questions, please put it on chat and I will read them out. We cannot hear you too loud from here. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, what was the slope of that line you showed, the data from New York, earlier clutch initiation? About how many days per year and over, let's see, that span is from the mid-80s?
30. Yeah, so what our data saw was it was an average of 3 days. This graph in this study specifically is about May 13th, May 14th. So that's a decline it's about a decline of about 5 days.
So it's 5 days over this
30-year period. So it's about 1 day every 6 years.
About 1 day every 6 years?
Yes, on average, according to the Ithaca study, yes. Yeah, of course.
Any other questions in the room?
Yeah.
So I guess other insects increase during, as you mentioned, might increase during, but do you know whether they're really eaten by the birds or?
So
How
this,
do
Can you repeat the question, please? We couldn't hear it.
relate the insect population you catch with what they take up, what the birds take up?
so this data set is just seeing what biomass is available for the birds to consume. So we don't even know in the Westchester area how much, what percent of bugs that are present are Nematocera. We correlated, well, yeah, we just relate it to the tree swallow diet specifically because Nematocera is going to be their most important food source. And it's going to be what they are primarily eating when initiating their chicks.
So that's known for there. Is it known for everywhere? The tree swallows everywhere, not the same insect?
It is definitely known that Nematocera is the most important because of the HUFA concentrations. The omega-3 fatty acids in other bird populations can synthesize that themselves and make it throughout their fledgling. And tree swallows are a population that can't. So the only way that they can get these HUFAs is from Nematocera specifically. They're aquatic emergent insects. And so their life cycle in which they live in the water allows them to absorb the HUFAs from primarily algae. So terrestrial insects like Lepidoptera and Coleoptera, they won't have those in them.
Thank you. And you have something on Zoom?
Yes, I've raised a lot of birds, a lot of bugs over the years, thousands of them. But the thing is, a couple of factors is competition and food availability and if the competition is strong, they might start earlier, and then of course and it's just not one species that's competing with the other birds. It can be several species.
Mm-hmm.
And then also availability of food. It depends on the temperature. And I've seen a really warm spring, and things have started as early as end of March, beginning of April. And then other years, some as late as late May, early June almost.
It's quite unfortunate how short the study period for this study is. We were going through a data set that was laid out by Peter Dunn specifically when it came to the timings in which we set our traps out. So it'd actually be very interesting to see how these populations continue, especially through a fall and winter like we've had thus far, which has been so warm and so devoid of rainfall, which is usually what kills these species out. I know Lepidoptera specifically and moth populations are on the rise at the moment that probably won't see next year with their eggs. So yeah, it's definitely been an abnormal year. So we don't know if these are outlier data in general at all.
In certain species, Lepidoptera, one of them, will be, a really high number one year and then almost crash the next year.
Exactly. Yeah, and we don't know if the Nematocera population within Westchester goes through like a boom bust system or not.
I have a question on Zoom. I guess not really a question, but Judy says, I'm surprised that pesticide use was not one of the causes for insect decline.
So for the paper in which I had cited before about causes of insect decline, they did not quote pesticide use because the area in which they were studying, they did not have enough data behind the area itself to be able to say what was being used and to what extent. So they didn't want to include that data set within their set just because none of it was definitive. But I'm pretty sure that it gets, they definitely mention it in the paper that it is it's in relation to the habitat destruction. It gets correlated within that because, I mean, once the habitat is gone and unlivable, it's basically destroyed. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think we can move on. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Oh, great. All right, so next we're gonna hear from Sage and Victoria. I'll get that set up. So we're gonna talk a little bit now about, we know something about what these birds are eating. So how might that potentially impact their exposure to different types of pollutants? You guys want to come on up? Okay. Is everyone on Zoom still good with like seeing the screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay.
Sound is good.
Awesome. All right, take it away, guys.
Right, so hi everyone, I'm Victoria. I'm a master's student at Westchester University. And I'm Sage, I'm an undergrad. And like Dr. Uehling, lovely intro for us, we're going to talk a little bit about our projects in microplastic detection of passerine fecal samples. Okay, so first of all, we have to kind of understand what microplastics are. So typically microplastics are identified as being less than 5 millimeters in size. And we'll get into what exactly it is we're looking at on the screen there, but that little circled blue fiber is actually considered a microplastic. This is under a microscope. So it's very, very tiny. And these very tiny pieces of plastic have a great effect on the animals that ingest them. Things like appetite suppressants, so they aren't eating, they're getting malnutrition because of that. It affects the function of enzymes and hormones within the body. It affects reproduction and reproductive cycles, and it often leads to death in any of the species that we find them in. Previously, there hasn't been a lot of work done in terrestrial environments for microplastics. A lot of what we know is based in marine ecosystems. So we know a lot about how it's passed in like aquatic ecosystems and all of that. But a lot of the terrestrial environments are unknown, but they are experiencing the effects of microplastics as well. Specifically for birds, there hasn't been a lot of study on microplastics. What has been studied is utilizing the GI tract of the deceased birds, but that's kind of difficult to do, so there's a very super small sample size. So we just don't know a lot about it. From the studies that do exist, we have been able to learn that birds are ingesting microplastics worldwide. And there are a couple different theories of how birds are getting microplastics into their systems. The first is atmospheric deposition. So that's the idea of microplastics that are small enough to be airborne, get lifted into the atmosphere, and then eventually fall back down onto an item that a bird might eat. Another theory is trophic transfer. So when we say trophic, we're referring to food webs. So this is the idea that an insect or macroinvertebrate, like Chris talked about, might have ingested a microplastic during some point in its life and then gets eaten by a bird, and that microplastic is transferred into the bird. And then there's the idea of microplastics coming in contact with their body and then birds using their mouth to preen their feathers, and the microplastic ends up into their mouth. So we don't know whether or not passerines are more or less affected by microplastics than any other group of birds, but they do present a really interesting opportunity for monitoring environmental microplastics. And that's because there are over 1,400 bird banding stations across the US and Canada. And these are stations that are already collecting birds for research, and birds very readily defecate during the banding process. So it provides many potential samples to ask and answer some research questions. And so in our research, the questions we wanted to look at were, does microplastic abundance change, microplastic abundance, color, and diet change between bird species? And is any of those differences explained by differences in diet and foraging strategy? And for me, I was focusing on 5 species of adult birds: gray catbird, white-throated sparrow, northern cardinal, common yellowthroat, and wood thrush. And I was looking at if microplastics presence varies between tree swallows and eastern bluebirds, specifically looking at if their diets and the type of insects that they consume impacts the amount of microplastics they're consuming. So in order to collect our samples for the adult birds, I got to work with Russian Woods Banding Station. They were very kind in letting us sample fecal samples from their birds from their past spring and fall banding seasons. And normally their method for capturing birds is passive mist netting, and they'll transfer the birds into a cloth bag until they're ready to be banded. For my research, they allowed us to put the birds into paper bags, and that way, if the bird produced a sample while inside the bag, I could then take that bag with me back to Westchester and process it in the lab.
And for my process, we looked at specifically nestlings for tree swallows and eastern bluebirds. And I was working with the nesting boxes at South Campus and at Stroud Preserve. And so we waited until day 3 of provisioning and day 12 of provisioning for tree swallows. And basically for day 3 nestlings, I don't know if you've ever seen them, they look like little gummy bears. You can kind of just pick them up and you put the jar below them and they poop into the jar for you. It's very nice. And then the day 12 nestlings look more like what I have in my hand in that second picture. And you just hold them and they poop into the jar as well. It's pretty nice.
All right, so you have a bird poop. How do you extract microplastics from it? So we start off with the sample in a jar, like Sage said, and we tried our best to eliminate any other contact with other plastic as much as possible. So we used a glass jar. You then immerse the sample in a potassium hydroxide solution, and that dissolves any of the like soft organic matter in the sample. And at that point, the sample goes through this filtering apparatus where all the liquid gets sucked into the waste flask, and we're left with all the solids on a filter. And at that point, when we take off the filter, we look at them each under a microscope, and that's usually what it looks like, a whole big mess of debris. So what exactly are we looking at on the filter? Oop. It's usually a mix of all kinds of things from dirt to natural fibers like cotton, a bunch of bug parts, so pieces of exoskeleton, and sometimes microplastics. So sometimes you can kind of tell visually, there's certain visual hints if something is a natural fiber, like cotton has a very characteristic helix shape to it. But if something looks like a microplastic, is suspected to be a microplastic, we ask the question, does it melt? And that's where our soldering iron comes in. So if it doesn't melt, then we don't have a microplastic. And if it does melt, yay or not yay, we have a microplastic. And then we ask our questions, or I should say we record the shape and the color of the microplastic. So in the picture in the bottom right, that's a clear microplastic fiber. And you can see on the left side of it is where I approached it with the soldering iron and it deformed. So it melted, and that's how we knew it was a microplastic.
So for results and predictions for my particular project, I am still working through the sample process. It takes a very long time to filter through all the samples and then look through each of them under the microscope. So I'm still working on all of that. But we did make observations in the field of the nest boxes. These 2 nests right up there with the trash in them, those are tree swallow nests. They have been, Hailey will talk more about this, but they have been using trash as part of their nesting material. And the one on the bottom there is the eastern bluebird nest. And we didn't really see much plastic present, at least visually in the field. So our predictions have been that there will be an increased amount of plastic in the tree swallow's diet as compared to the bluebird's diet, just because of the presence of it within the nest itself.
And in my data, I've gotten through a majority of my samples. So I can say anecdotally, at least, that nearly every one of my samples had at least one microplastic present. Overwhelmingly, the most common shape were the microfibers, and then a majority of those were clear. I just wanted to showcase some of the pictures I was able to capture through the microscope. So on the top, you can see the kind of like a jumble of different fibers. It might be hard to see from far away, but there's a whole bunch of synthetic and natural fibers mixed around. And on the bottom, you can see a piece of exoskeleton, like I said, and attached to it is a clear microfiber. And the sort of reasoning behind why we're thinking we see a lot of microfibers is because synthetic textiles, like our clothing, shed microplastics. So, for example, like polyester textiles.
So we can gain a lot of insight on microplastics impact based on the diet of a bird. So as Chris was kind of talking about, tree swallows rely on these aquatic emergent insects for macronutrients like HUFAs. And we can assume, or from other studies, we know that aquatic emergent insects are getting microplastics from their environment. So we're kind of looking at this trophic transfer, as Victoria mentioned, in tree swallow species. And more than that, there are also studies that have noted that microplastics can reduce and alter the quality of HUFA content. So not only are these insects introducing these microplastics to them, but they're also being a degraded food quality. So they're not getting what they need from these, from their food. And we also know that eastern bluebirds do not rely on external sources of HUFA, so they are mostly getting terrestrial insects for their food, which aren't as exposed to microplastics and likely will have less of that from trophic transfer.
Some of the wider impacts that we expect or hope that our research can touch on, there's not a lot of research yet into the trophic transfer of microplastics from passerines into their predators like birds of prey, as well as the idea of birds and especially migratory birds as potential vectors of microplastics, meaning when birds migrate, where are they bringing microplastics from, where are they depositing them? And then I also hope that the focus on backyard bird species, which are very recognizable and familiar for people, can be they can be ambassadors for the problem of microplastic pollution and bring awareness to the public. So we want to thank the Russian Woods Banding Station staff and volunteers for allowing us to collect samples from their birds. They have been really excellent to work with, and they're very enthusiastic about this work, which is just great. We also want to thank the University Student Housing ground managers and the Stroud Preserve ground managers for allowing us to have the nest boxes and for Sage to do her work there. And then, of course, this work would not be possible without the funding from the Robert Cooper Audubon Society Fox Student Grant, the Westchester University CSM Graduate Research Award, and the Surrey Award. All right, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. All right, questions, Naresh.
So I just want to make sure I understood this correctly, and we'll have to repeat that for the people online. So are you suggesting that the microplastics are coming in through the insects that they're eating? So I mean, do the size scales match up? I didn't realize an insect could eat an entire fiber.
Yeah, so it's a possibility. It's kind of crazy when you look at it like on the microscope slide, but if you look at like this first one here, these big pieces right there, that's like the head of an ant. And that fiber there is like next to that. So I don't know if that helps with scale, but these are really, really tiny fibers. And it's possible that we don't actually really know, but it's a possibility that we're kind of looking into. And it might be that the like fragmented pieces we're seeing are from insects, but it's definitely a possibility.
But there might also be micro nanoplastic,
Yeah.
smaller pieces than what you can see.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to take a question on Zoom. Greg asks, have you saved some of each sample for other possible tests, such as toxins, heavy metals, pesticides?
It's a very good question.
That is a good question. I know for at least my samples, we split them in half, and we're actually going to be doing like metabarcoding on those to look at what the insects they actually are eating, stuff like that. I don't know if we've thought about doing any further testing for like other chemicals and stuff. That's a different question for Dr. Uehling.
But the cool thing about that is Sage will get to see with her samples, how does the composition of the insects that the birds are eating match up with the composition of microplastics being found in the same sample.
Yeah, it'll be cool to kind of see like what Chris was talking about with like the type of insect, and if that actually does have an increase in the amount of microplastics, if it is the aquatic emergent insects, or if there really is just no link at all.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Art.
I'm sure you said this, but I missed a key part of your methodology. You're collecting, you wash the plumage, so this is what you're sampling is what's on the plumage, not internally?
We're doing
Fecal sample.
samples.
And fecal samples.
Yes.
Thank you.
I was trying to avoid saying
No, you
poop
said
too many
it.
times.
Yeah, it is poop.
Yes.
They're doing a really crappy research.
Crappy research, yes.
Well, sidebar there that you should look at crap on the Urban Dictionary. My question is, what was it? You mentioned towards the end that microplastics are more associated with the aquatic emergent insects rather than the terrestrial ones. Why would that be? I have a theory, but why would that be?
From what I've seen in the studies and stuff, it's mostly because they're getting it from what they consume in their environment. So like rivers and streams and what we know about like marine and aquatic pollution, there's a lot of microplastics in rivers, and that's kind of where their food source is, that's where their breeding ground is, that's where they spend like the first part of their life. And so during that, they are consuming and retaining these microplastics, and we're kind of looking at that trophic transfer if that has any impact.
Is anybody looking in the water in the area there? About microplastics in the water?
I think
I think
there
so.
was
Isn't that
microplastic.
Okay, yeah, I think another lab is working on some of that work. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Yes, Savish.
Can I just make a comment?
Mhm.
So I would be careful about your very first slide, right? Your very first slide, which makes claims around enzyme and hormone effects. My sense is, and I read a lot about this because I'm interested, is that's not very well known, right? So I think there are suspicions, but it's been really hard to connect the toxicology of these fibers and to anything from a metabolic point of view, because it's hard to disconnect the issue of the physical impact of the fibers. So I would be very careful about the claims on your first.
And I think that's a good point. And the reason it's so difficult is because there's such a wide variety of like polymers that plastics can be made of. Some are harmful, or some we know are harmful, right? And some we don't know yet. So it's hard, it really is hard to say when you're, like you said, you're talking about the physical microplastic, but you don't know what it's made out of.
Definitely. I think I was reading a study that was more on not of a fiber-based plastic, which is where I got that information from. So that's a very good point.
Thank you.
Any more questions on Zoom?
I just, if I may, it got me thinking, it's not something you would have looked at in your study specifically, but many of us feed birds, of course, and we feed them typically with seeds and so forth, setting aside mealworms or suet. But, well, I guess even with suet, it just made me wonder whether anyone is looking at the microplastic content of some kinds of bird food and or suet. You know, are we feeding this stuff to our birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for
Yeah, I
it.
have no idea.
Yes.
Future research.
Have you made any conclusions as to which birds have the most microplastics?
So I'm just about finishing actually collecting data, and then Sage is pretty early on data collection too, so we haven't done any analysis yet, unfortunately.
Thank you. I see no more questions. Well, thank you both. Thank you.
All right. So we're gonna end today hearing from Hailey. So we're going all the way from diet to what potential pollutants diet are exposing birds to, and we're gonna end today with thinking more about trash, but kind of from a different angle. So Hailey, do you want to come on up and we can get started?
Hi, everyone. Like Dr. Uehling said, My name's Hailey Melvin. I'm a senior undergraduate student at Westchester University. For my independent research, I studied trash found within rural and suburban area nests of cavity nesting birds. And then on this slide right here is a tree swallow nest with a soft pretzel wrapper from Wawa. So trash is becoming an increasing threat to wildlife with increasing populations of humans in suburban areas. It's causing a rise in human interactions with animals and, of course, the pollution that we produce. In a study done on Galapagos finches, nests found in urban areas contained more trash than nests in rural areas. Most studies on human pollution have been done on oceanic animals, and little to no research has been done specifically on cavity nesting birds. So I did my internship with Dr. Uehling in the spring and summer this past year, and one of my jobs with her is to observe the growing nest in the breeding season. So I would look at the nest, measure it, see how tall it is, see what's containing in it. And as Chris and Sage and I saw, there was a lot of nests that had trash containing them visibly right here. These are two tree swallow nests that had plastic within them, and this intrigued me to do a study on this. So the 4 species that were in this research was the tree swallow, eastern bluebird, house wren, and house sparrow. As you all may already know, but I'll go over this again just in case. Tree swallow nests use grass and bird feathers as their nesting material. Eastern bluebirds use, again, grass and animal hair as their nesting material. House wrens use fine twigs, animal hair, and have been known to use plastic string and fabric string. And house sparrows are the odd ones out of this group, using a wide variety of nesting material, including dried vegetation, animal hair, feathers, and plastic. At the end of these slides, I'll show you all the pieces of trash that I found in the house sparrow nest, but we were unable to use the data taken from the house sparrow nest due to them being outliers and quantity issues. So the 2 areas I did my research in was Westchester University's South Campus, which is obviously located in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and that was our suburban area. And the other area was Stroud Preserve in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which was the rural area. So Westchester University South Campus is an apartment complex for students, and they have a large area behind it, which is where we had the nest boxes located. This area is highly trafficked through students and grounds crew. And then Stroud Preserve is 571 acres of open land use to people. And this area is kept fairly trash free due to volunteers that clean up the area. So 3 questions were asked in this study. The first one was, is there a difference between the amount of trash found at Stroud Preserve and South Campus, Westchester South Campus, and rugby fields? The second question was, are there differences of quantity trash found within the nest of different bird species? And the last question was, what type of trash was utilized the most? So Dr. Uehling and I collected 35 nests from both locations. These were then bagged and then brought back to the lab for observations. And these nests were collected with permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So don't go out doing this on your own. So I dissected each nest thoroughly, separating the trash from the natural material. And every piece of trash, I weighed it and measured it in length and width. And the pieces of trash were categorized for specific parameters. There were 6 different ones, which included plastic, plastic string, fabric, fabric string, paper, and unknown. The unknown items were put through a burn test to determine whether if it was actually natural material or trash. And we also looked at it under a microscope. Victoria actually helped with some of these pieces to determine. But basically, I used a sewing needle. I heated it up with a flame, and I touched the objects, and whether or not if it burned or melted, I was able to determine if it was natural or not. So based off the 3 questions that were asked, there was 3. Oh, sorry. Getting a little ahead of myself. Out of the 35 nests that were collected, 51% of the nests had, or 51% of the nests had no pieces of trash in them, while 49% of the nests had 1 or more pieces of trash in them. The average total number of pieces of trash was 7.06, and the mass average of the pieces of trash was 0.24 grams. So, like I was saying before, out of the 3 questions that were asked, there was 3 different graphs created. We're still doing statistical analysis, so we cannot determine if these results are significant from each other or not. But this graph shows the average number of pieces of trash within the nest from South Campus and Stroud. And as you can see that South Campus had a higher number of pieces of trash within their nests compared to Stroud. And then this one is the average number of pieces of trash within the different species. And as you can see, the house wren had a higher average number of trash compared to the tree swallow and the eastern bluebird. Tree swallow had the second highest average, and then the eastern bluebird had the lowest, which was essentially 0. And then lastly, we looked at the 6 parameters and how much trash was found within the nest, and plastic string was the most frequently used out of all the nests from both areas. So to reiterate what I just said, South Campus had the most trash found within the nest compared to Stroud Preserve. And this is crucial data that illustrates the negative effects of human pollution on wildlife, and specifically these cavity nesting birds species. And house wren utilize the most trash within their nests, and most of the trash that they use was plastic string, which was again the most frequently used out of all the species of birds. And this could be potentially because they use a lot of fine twigs that I talked about before, and those can be easily disrupted. So they could be using the plastic string to wrap it around and stabilize their nest. Even though this seems like an innovative way for the house wren to keep their nests together, plastic string is extremely dangerous for animals and birds. In a study done on Galapagos finches, 18% of their nestlings died to strangulation from plastic string. And I believe in more data and years of research from these species of birds, it would continue to show the negative impacts of human pollution on these species. Thank you to everyone who helped me with this research, and thank you to everybody who listened. Obviously, Dr. Jennifer Uehling, who allowed me to be an intern with her and helped me with my own research. Nate Rice, who gave us the permits to collect the nest and for me to be here. And Dr. Fork, Dr. Chandler, and Victoria for helping me distinguish the natural material from trash. And of course, Sage and Christopher for helping me with this research as well. And for the good stuff, this was the house sparrow nest.
Oh my God.
One nest.
One nest?
Yeah. Pretty crazy. And then this was one of the house wren nests. It's kind of hard to see, but those are all, most of it was fishing wire from here. So this was the plastic string that I was talking about with the house wren nest. Yeah. Thank you. I'll keep it up.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Well, I'll just, you mentioned in terms of grams, 24 grams. But in relation to the whole mass of a nest, what does that represent? And for example, here, the house sparrows, was half of the nest plastic or what?
So compared to like the proportion of the nest, the highest percentage, I believe, was 4% of the nest
That
was
for-
trash
for house.
for the house sparrow. Everything else was mostly below 1%.
So, Hailey, would you argue that plastic spring is good then? Because they're clearly helping it build nests.
What?
You can think of it that way, but if you
I
look
mean,
at,
how is it doing?
I mean, if they are ingesting it, if you look at it with, yes, if you look at it with Sage's and Victoria's like aspect, it would be definitely like a very interesting research to look at it that way, because they obviously could be ingesting it if they're using their beaks to bring it into their nest, tie it. They could definitely be ingesting it for sure.
Is that why house sparrows are diminishing?
What'd you say? I'm sorry.
The numbers of house sparrows are diminishing.
Yeah.
So-
Well,
so
they're
they
also,
need to, plastic.
yeah, I'm not really too fond of house sparrows, but they're a little invasive, but it's okay.
We have a question on Zoom. Judy asks, are there any groups advocating for reductions in the use of materials which generate microplastics? It seems that we are learning about the hazards of microplastics, but we are making more and more materials which release microplastics.
That's a very good question. I'm not really sure about that. I know that a lot of the stuff that I found within my nest seemed to be a lot of like farming material and a lot of things that like grounds crew use out, like a lot of landscaping. So I think that would be definitely like something to advocate for those groups to not use as much like plastic with that.
Thank you. And so Greg had sort of an answer. A huge issue is the use of synthetic materials for clothing, sample polyester, versus rayon, which is made from natural material with processed with chemicals.
It says accepted.
Okay, just have you do it again, because that's the accepted, not approved thing I was telling you about.
Oh, yeah, that's that. It says you're accepted, then you pull it out.
And then it says do it again.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
All right. So Greg continues, it always bothers me when environmental and bird organizations sell polyester shirts, something to educate people about to advocate for change. But I don't know about organized opposition. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Comment on that. So for my research at Russian was I asked people to wear 100% cotton clothing during sampling days. And people said that they had a really hard time finding 100% cotton clothing in their closets.
I could add, for all of our research, we, in the nesting boxes and looking at them, we only wore like cotton or natural fibers as much as we could, and it was very difficult for all of us to find clothes to wear, especially like have it up for the week and all that. Like it was very difficult.
Right. Interesting. Yes, Art.
I have a personal experience with string in a bird's nest, and it was not a very happy experience.
Really?
This was in a peregrine falcon nest on the cliff at the Delaware Water Gap, which had been occupied by a pair for the last more than 15 years. It never succeeded, but it looked, let's see, I think the year was 2014, when we knew that there was one chick in the nest. And in this case, the birds kept shifting between an abandoned common raven's nest and a rock ledge. So this year they were in the raven's nest. We went there to band, we got the chick, and its right wing was broken. The humerus was broken, and it had begun to heal displaced. There was a big callus, so it certainly wasn't a fresh break. Its left tarsus had a big piece of heavy string wrapped around it.
Wow.
Here's what I think happened. Of course, this is an N of 1, and this is purely conjectural. Well, peregrines don't add anything to the nest. Okay, when they took over the raven's nest, they just took it as is. But we know that corvids are famous for collecting trash and putting it in the nest. So what I think happened was that the ravens had picked up this piece of string and put it in the nest, okay? The chick got it, its leg caught in that, it was quite tight around its tarsus, tried to escape and in the process fractured its wing.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, that bird was not releasable, you know, you can't re-break the wing and hope for it to heal and so forth. And so that would have been the only success of that site, but that's another example of what happens when we humans leave trash around and then.
Yeah, I think the overall, like what you all should get out of it is that like recyclings, like know like where you're actually putting like your actual like recyclable items, and like if you are like a fisherman, like never leaving line out, because when I know I fish, when I go I grab fishing wire that's stuck in trees, because obviously a lot of animals can be caught in it, not just birds but any. So I think it's just really important to pick up trash whenever you see it too. I mean, that's what we've all been doing when we're out at the nest sites, because it's everywhere. And I think that if we all do like a little bit part, it can all be better.
I'm gonna do a question on Zoom.
I'm sorry.
Let me get a question on Zoom, on the chat, Greg. Bob Elliott asks, to your knowledge, were any of the nestlings in these nests injured or killed by the trash? I once found a dead baby robin hanging from a nest with plastic string wrapped around one of its legs.
Wow.
All its siblings had fledged successfully.
Wow.
I guess it follows from Oxford's.
Not from our breeding season. We didn't have any nestlings like tangled in anything, but I mean it's definitely becoming like an increasing problem with nestlings for sure.
We also have all the fecal samples from nestlings, so we're going to see there are microplastics. There's a relationship to the plastics that are in the nest.
Can you repeat the comment, one of you? Hard to hear.
Hailey,
With what? With what you said?
Yeah, can you just summarize what I said to the next?
Oh, so we did get obviously feces from the nestlings, so we can determine if there was like any like plastic within it, and can compare like what's within like the nest. Could be potential like connection there.
Yes.
Was the number of nests from each of the species that you were looking at equal, or did you, like, how many nests did you sample per species that you were looking at?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the number like off the top of my head. Definitely a larger number of tree swallows. I would say maybe the next one would be like house wrens. I'm trying to think of how many from each site. Definitely like 3 to 4 house wrens per site, and probably like 8 to 10 tree swallows altogether. But the house wrens, we only had 2 nests. So.
Any other questions in the room? All right, I'll go to one on Zoom. Have you thought about, Geraldine asks, have you thought about gather data on how weather could impact the amount of trash used on a nest? If natural materials, grasses and pine needles are wet due to rainy weather, would the birds be more likely to use the trash, which would not absorb moisture?
That's a good question. I think that would definitely depend on the species. I'm not really sure. I don't know if that's a question for Dr. Uehling, if birds will use like wet nesting material.
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think you would think about whether trash versus natural material dries out faster, right?
Right.
And also maybe, Hailey, you observed that there are dumpsters right next to this site, right? And
Yes.
there are parts of the dumpster that are covered with the dumpster covers. So maybe it's possible the birds are going in there to get dry pieces.
Yeah.
So, good question.
The dumpster are plastic.
Yeah, the dumpsters are plastic.
Yeah.
And
I mean, yeah. I saw firsthand when I would go in the mornings to look at the nest, there would be birds like in the big dumpsters and flying out of it. So they were obviously like going in there.
Any in the room? Any questions?
I
can-
if
I
you
can-
want a relationship between the plastic in the feces and the plastic in the nest. You might need something more specific like mass spec analysis or something a little more, because how are you going to relate really the plastic of the nest with, you know, the chemistry of it with the chemistry of what type of plastic?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's a good point.
Mm.
We haven't finished identifying the plastic nutrients yet. So I think once we get to the point of fully identifying those, then we can address that question of like, okay, if it's all fibers, then we will know, okay, it's probably from clothing and not from the nest, right? But if it does bear resemblance to the things we're seeing in the nest, then that could be a really great next step.
What were those comments? Again, we can't hear on Zoom, so.
Oh, what Dr. Uehling said, we haven't gone through all of the feces from the nestlings, but if the feces come back with, what'd you say? The fibers, the microfibers in it, most likely it wouldn't be from the nest, it would be related to clothing.
All right,
Thank
Greg,
you.
did you have something? A question?
Yeah, I did. I just want to, thank Hailey. This is really fascinating. All of the talks have been. The blue fibers, I'm looking at the house sparrow, the photograph, the house sparrow nest. I see a number of blue fibers. For some years, I mused about the source of those because they show up frequently in oriole nests. I've seen them in particular woven in, but I've also seen them in kingbird nests. And I finally, I think, figured it out. I believe these come from tarps, the blue tarps in particular, when they fray. And I realized that we were using some tarps in our backyard and they fray and they produce these blue fibers. And I said, oh my God, in terms of how much, we were contributing. So speaking of dumpsters, but I think those tarps are a huge source of this stuff. Anyway.
Yeah, one of my main goals from this study, I want to meet with USH Housing of Westchester University and just like show them like how much like what they do and what's like affected by them, because obviously there's like the sports fields around the areas where the nest boxes are, and they obviously use tarps, and that's like another thing that like I would want to like discuss with them about that too. So
fantastic.
Differences, and if you check that, you might have to use UV mechanism to see, because they see things differently than us.
Right. Yeah. This.
So it have complicated coloring.
Yeah.
Question.
He just asked about color preferences, and this one actually in particular did have a good amount of like blue fibers in it, a lot of like blue plastic, but in the other nest there wasn't really any particular color preference, I would say.
Also probably depends on what's there.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
I don't think we should read too much into this.
No, we just said this bird liked blue. That's what I took out of it. This bird's like me and likes blue. Sure, it identified as a bluebird.
You mentioned sports fields and things.
Yes.
Right? There's artificial turf a big issue
Wow.
here?
In the ones that I dissected, I don't think there was any turf, but that definitely would be interesting because the field that's right next to it is the soccer field that is turf. So yeah, that definitely would be interesting if they were picking that up, because that can also look like grass to them too. So we don't obviously understand like why they're picking it up. Obviously, I don't know if they think it's natural or just an innovative way, but yeah, that's definitely very interesting.
Yeah, one more, maybe a couple more questions here. Julius, when you talk about the plastics used by landscapers, are you talking about the plastic mesh used with grass planting?
Is that like what we covered that one?
Yeah, sure. It's the one here.
Oh, okay, planting. There was just some pieces like number 20 on here looks like some type of fabric, and some of the stuff that I like concluded like myself, I would say that it looked like something that landscaper would use, but I obviously like can't exactly tell like what a small like piece of trash is. Other than like the ones like number 3, we said looks like a Target bag. So like there's some pieces of trash, and then number 27 on here is a gum wrapper. It's Orbit. If you, I don't know if you can see that far away, but
There's actually a question about trash piece number 3. Said looks like it
3.
might have blood on it. That's a bit.
yeah, it looks like we're pretty sure it's a Target bag. So that's why it looks like blood, because it's like the red Target.
It seems like a recycling need is for old clothes. I have some old things I'd like to recycle, but haven't found a way to do that. The only option seems to be to throw them in the trash, and that seems like a way the fibers may end up in the environment. That was from Bob Elliott.
Yeah, I mean, that also is a good point with that. Not really sure about that one. You could always go to the thrift and donate the clothes, but
It's more about the choices you make in the future of what you buy.
yes.
Don't feel so bad about what you already.
Yes, you can't blame yourself in the past for not knowing. Which is a very good point, Victoria. I'm not philosophical or anything, but
Any last questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. You want to close it out?
Sure, I'll just say, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your great questions, and thanks for having us. It was awesome to be here. So yeah, hopefully we can come back in the future and give you some updates on some of this work.
And if any of you want to do a full 50-minute talk, please reach out to me. You can reach out to me at programs@dvoc.org.
Awesome. Thank you.
A lot of trash.
I know, right? Well, it was really kind of fortuitous because I did not plan to study trash when I got to Westchester, and then the trash just found us. So it was
Can we get
yeah.
a picture of your students?
Oh, of course, yeah. Guys, are you
Everybody
okay
on
taking
Zoom,
a
thank you for
picture
joining
altogether?
us.
Okay.
Everybody in the meeting.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all the students, Chris, Victoria, Sage, Hailey, fantastic. Thank you.
All right, good night, everybody.
Thank you, Naveen.